Elaine Bongarlock. My husband, Dr. Theophilus Bongarlock, is accompanying me. He discusses 18th century medicine at places like Fortress Louisbourg, which is a place where we are going this week. It's a very pleasant place. It's Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. He also has discussed medicine at Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Niagara in the north, and Fort Deschartres and Fort Massac in Midwest. I see to it that Theo is fed, watered, and takes off his time to go be relieved. And I usually sit and stitch or read while he talks. And when he leaves, I talk. So I have some clues of 18th century medicine. It's not my favorite subject. When we started reenacting about 25 years ago, I meandered through the sutlers. Sutlers are the stores that are at reenactments. I wandered through the sutlers' shops looking for clothes that I'd like to purchase. I looked at the quality, I looked at the color, every facet of that clothing that I could. And I thought, like so many of you, I have a background in sewing. What am I doing buying them? So I went talking to people, and people suggested the catalogs where you could find patterns, all sorts of patterns, commercially made. You can get them on the internet. They're a little more complete on the internet. What you get here is not always complete in their directions. It can be a real puzzlement. Or sometimes you can go to places like Canada, and they do really, really neat patterns of specific clothing, especially the dress-up clothing. This is a sack-back gown, and this is a man's suit. People were helpful with patterns. They were helpful with fabrics. I found a couple of books that you're welcome to pass around and look at that talk about the textiles for colonial clothing. This is American colonial clothing, so some are appropriate for the French, but not all. And this one is Guide to Choosing 21st Century Fabrics for 18th century clothing. And then Beth Gilgan is an author who's written Tidings from the 18th Century. And in her letters, she often will cite a certain garment, and she'll put the patterns that you can draw out from the graph paper to make the clothing that you desire. Her book's a good one. It takes time and effort to find the patterns, and especially to find the fabrics. I've made some mistakes. And I've turned out some acceptable clothing for the avocation. Finding fabrics within the category of natural materials is a challenge. Wool isn't often found close to home or even south of Springfield, Illinois. I have to go to Chicago to find fabrics, and even then various specialty weaves are nearly impossible to locate. Theo always finds fabrics that suit his style, so there's always something on my sewing table for him. There are 3 questions that reenactors discuss frequently. I've shortened them down to be really precise. 1, did coiffes or hats originate in their provinces of France? Did the women wear bodices? And did the bodices have a purpose? And did all the fabric for New France come from France? Interpretations of the sources will differ amongst us, but I'll answer these as I progress. There are 4 natural fabrics that were used in the 18th century. 2 were from animals, wool and silk, and 2 were from plants, linen and cotton. Wool wool was sheared from sheep, and silk was processed from the cocoons of domesticated silkworms. And the fibers of the flax plant and cotton plants were gleaned to produce linen or cotton fabric. Other natural materials used for wearing leather. This, you don't wear a purse, but leather. Straw. And wood. Most of the fabrics sold to New France and the Mississippi Valley were woven in France, except cotton before 1730. Wool, when it was spun, could be of a long or short fiber that would create a cloth that's loose and fluffy or tight and compact. This we're going to pass around, and you can just feel the different tightnesses of the weaves. You can see the different weaves, feel the different levels of softness of the wools. Thank you.
Or do you want me to come?
There were 24 varieties of wool because they were made in 24 different communities of France. Some of those, the plain, the twill, and the satin weaves have stuck around. Many of the other weaves are no longer in existence. With wool, they could, your hat's up there.
I can get. Oh, this is yours.
Wool could be heated and with moisture, and that would toughen the wool and felt it, and it was made of a good weight for hats, and it would be water resistant. Other wool was knitted, and they wore toques. The other way of softening the wool up was teasing. I like that word, teasing, in which they raised the nap of the wool that made the wool much softer and gentle. Wool was milled in various lengths, varying widths, and was sold by the aune, which is spelled A-U-N-E. And an aune equals 3 86/100 English feet, or 29% more fabric than in a yard. Wool was appreciated for its warmth, durability, and abundance for breeches, petticoats, jackets, and cloaks. Hats and knitted garments, bags, and blankets were often made of wool. Next is silk. Chinese first made silk by unrolling the fiber off of the cocoon of the silkworm. The technique traveled to Japan, India, Spain, Italy, and finally to France in 1466. There were different types of silk thread that was woven into 2 varieties of fabrics that France imported. Lustring was a finish of the ironing the silk, and made it for and watering the silk would make a wavy pattern. Several silk fabrics were made: satin, taffeta, gauze, and ferradine, which was a blend of threads that resulted in damask, brocade, or velvet. Linings for garments, scarves. Here's a scarf. There's a scarf for a tissue. Chemises or shirts, petticoats, or fancy waistcoats were made of silk.
And we just toss this to you. You know, in France, they raise silkworms in the south of France.
Yes. Okay. Linen. Just as wool came from several communities in France, so there were many, many styles of linen. Yeah, linen from Laval, Mallee linen, which is also a sailcloth, hempen linen, linen from Lyon, linen from Bluton-Châtillon, which was mattress linen. The characteristics of linen that we thought about were the diameter of the thread, the tightness of the spin, its strength, and its softness. When flax was woven, the compactness of its weave could be a very sheer cloth, or it could be a very, very heavy cloth. I'll pass this one around. This is my chemise. It's a heavy linen. It's my winter chemise. Very white. Linen was nice for garments, bed sheets, and handkerchiefs, but great for utilitarian goods like tents, curtains, and sails. Imagine having a white tent. Before 1730, France could import cotton from India only to export it to France. And that's the site of the tablecloth. There is an excellent example of the cotton fabric that came printed from India. India and France had cotton wars until an agreement allowed France to import the thread from India. And so then they could weave the cotton yard goods. Prior to that agreement, France supplied New France with the printed fabric and constructed garments from India. Voyagers, of course, carried the garments or the fabric to the outposts in the spring. The French people as far west as Indiana and Illinois were supplied by the voyagers. After the agreement, France made the cloth and garments that they shipped to New France and New Orleans. Shipments went north on the Mississippi River, and fabric raided from the French ships by the English or the Spanish or anybody else who wanted to do it was smuggled into New France and to New Orleans. Theo finds the economics of the times very fascinating, and he can tell you a whole lot more on that score than I can. So what garments were made of each of the fabrics? Well, let's start with coifs. This is, there's another one. This coif is my really old one. Most of my pictures are with this coif. We found it in Nova Scotia at Louisbourg in 1995. My friend Margaret had already been making hats for years and years and years. She saw this on a gal. We stopped her. She was selling lemons. And we just did a real good examination of her cloth. And Mark said, I can make that. And so probably, we were there in the summer, so probably in September or October, she had her array of hats out, including the Nova Scotia. And it's been my signature hat for years. And the poor hat looks like it. So I've gone to another version of the Nova Scotia. It's called the Hat of Paris.
How were they? I mean, they were different from hats in France. They had made a different version of that hat. And so it was specifically Nova Scotia style, and you wouldn't find
Correct.
it in France?
Well, it's Nova Scotia because we found it in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
But when it comes to the hats, one of those discussions is, did they come from specific parts of France? And yes, they did, because each woman, as she was growing up, before the age of 13, was taught to make her hat. And of course, her hat was probably from the place where she lived. And when she moved to the New World maybe as a young bride, maybe just as a young jeune fille or a king's daughter, she took her hat with her. She also took her skills with her. And so what would you continue to do? You'd use your skills and still make your same hat from the same province. Most of the women of Europe have worn hats, and you know if you see a little hat that's got a tipped up point here, oh, that one probably came from Holland. If you saw a mob cap, that one's from England. I don't know exactly what the German hats look like. I can't recall. That's okay. But hats were worn by women of almost every country of the world, and they each have their own indicative kind of hat. It's probably not really very significant, but it is the culture of where the person lived that they carried with them to where they were going. Okay. Cotton and linen were prevalent. Cotton wasn't quite as prevalent because it came from India and it was more expensive. But eventually, as they were able to make their own cotton and they came up with nice colors and different weights, so that you can have a really, really light one, which is what this hat is, or you can have a much heavier one, or you might have canvas for use. Yeah. So here's linen and cotton. Linen. When you look at 18th century paintings of people, notice the styles of the head coverings and the aprons, which were made of white or colored linen or cotton. Linen and cotton were prominent for the fabrics for undergarments for men and women. The shirt, which is sometimes, for a man, referred to as a chemise, was made of linen, but cotton was used when it was available, and the soldiers got their shirts of cotton. Inventories of belongings, which were made after people died, frequently listed chemises or shirts for men and women, and they were listed as heavyweight linen or lightweight linen or cotton. Some of the shirts were of a longer length, so the man could reach down and draw the back of his shirt up to the front and put it over his belt, and then he had underwear. Which, you know, if you're wearing wool breeches, you really appreciate having something between you and that wool. Okay. Over the shirts, men wore waistcoats. And this is true whether they were military, which Stephen's dressed military today. He's not taking military to Louisburg, so he thought he'd wear it today. The waistcoats are made of wool. Where were we?
Don't want me to turn this. Okay.
And they could be made of wool and have a linen lining or a cotton lining. This has been around a few years too.
You made that?
Pardon?
Did you make that?
Yes. He finally, for the first 10 years, I think, of reenacting, he was habitant and doctor, so he didn't need a uniform. Somewhere back in when was that?
About 95.
About 95, he decided he'd go military. So, he has a full outfit. He has a sleeve waistcoat, because sometimes that's what the officers want you to wear. And he has the breeches of wool. His are lined, though, just to keep him comfortable. And he has a justiciar. I did not make his justiciar. That was an inherited thing from someone along the way.
And what is that?
Pardon?
A justiciar?
Justiciar.
What
It's
is
also called a greatcoat.
Okay.
And, it's mid-thigh length. It's 2 layers of wool on the skirts. nice big cuff. The colors that are here are part of the Marines color form. They had to have brass buttons. Because he's a surgeon major, his has a gold trim around it. And he does go into reenactments, not always carrying his musket. Sometimes he goes in as the doctor. And so as the doctor, he is called the surgeon major, and they'll just stand there in the middle of the battle with all the guns firing. Surgeon major, we need you over here. And he has some good stories to tell about that. The women wore shirts, and you've seen my second thing. This is what I made. It's ancient, soft. And they wore chemise, or they wore bodices over their chemises because the chemises are low cut. And they're thin fabric. It's something to cover you up, to have a little modesty. Bodices could be worn instead of stays. Stays, you'll hear a lot of people complain about stays. I don't. I wear them frequently. I was talking to Suzanne earlier about stays. She wanted to know, how do you make them? I said, well, you get yourself a t-shirt, take all your clothes off, take your overclothes off, put your t-shirt on, and have somebody come along and wrap duct tape. Just wrap duct tape all around you snugly. And when you get that done, up to your armpits, and when you get that done, you cut it down the center. And then you lay it out, and you can cut your stays. Stays are really very warm. I mean, there's an inside fabric, there's an outside fabric, and there's a stiffening fabric in between. And to those inside fabrics, you stitch your stays. Now, when they have the baleen parts of the whale, they could put a baleen sheet up in here like this at an angle, and it would do a good job of holding. But I think baleen's probably flexible enough that you didn't feel just all wired in. This is strapping wire. Let me tell you, strapping wire is unforgiving. It doesn't bend at all unless it's just at the front. And it could bend there, but you saw the stay busk that went in? A friend of mine carved it, it's lovely. And there's some notches to keep your stay busk in place. And it keeps the front of your stays from curling up. Now, these have been around for a while too. They've been worn a lot. They tie up the back. You could also have jumps. Jumps would tie down the front and the back, or just down the front. If you're a woman and you have them just tie down the front, you can get yourself into your jumps really easily. But if you're married and you like stays, you've always got somebody around who can tie them up for you. Men from the waist down who were not of the Marines wore breech clouts, which is a strap of fabric about yay long. They put it here over a belt and here over a belt between your legs. I hope they lined those too, because the wool wouldn't be a comfort if they didn't. And that was, voyagers wore those mostly. Farmers wore breeches called slops. There's no tie at the bottom of slops. That's what they look like, slops. They were probably of heavy linen or lightweight wool, maybe cotton. Men of all walks of life wore breeches of wool, linen, or cotton. The breeches might have a French fly, which is what most of us wear today, Or they might have a broad fall buttoned here at the waistband, but this is a flap and buttons here on either side. They may have had pockets in their breeches. Today they usually do, but then maybe not. Mr. Bungerlock here apprised me that he really needed pockets. It took me a while before I decided I would make pockets. Women over their chemises wear petticoats. No, mid-calf. This one happens to be a linen petticoat. When we went to the costume design department, and most people just wear their petticoats just gathered on a string and no fancy anything around there. But Elizabeth, who was the director at the fabric shop, told us about this method of doing it. And one reason I like this method of doing it, you don't look so, you look a little more slim in the front and in the middle of the back, because all your gathering is done in 5 rows on one side and 5 rows on the other side, 5 rows on the back and 5 rows on the other side of the back. And it can be tied together with 2 sets of threads or ropes, which makes it easier to wear because, you can tighten the one that needs the tightening and you can loosen the one that's most uncomfortable for you more easily. They usually are left with a 10-inch slit to the side, and this is so that a woman can access her pocket. This one doesn't have that. She didn't carry a purse. She might carry a basket when she went marketing, but she didn't carry a purse. She just carried a pocket underneath her clothing. And we got buckets. She could have her pocket be really neat and pretty. And this especially if she's a 13-year-old girl. 13 years of age, a girl who's learned to make soap, make candles, take care of kids, cook over an open fire, and do the laundry in a big pot out in the yard. She's also learned to stitch, so she's going to stitch her pocket and wear it on the outside of her clothing, so she can advertise that she's ready to get married at 13. Or they can just be the woman of the house who's been around for a long while and just really doesn't have time to mess around with all that stuff because she's got 4 or 5 children to attend to, and her pocket would be plain, but large enough that she can put just about everything in it. Then they had jackets, and I'm going to move over here because I've got some. One is the blue linen that you saw me wearing when we got here. It got a little warm. I'm really in my very undress. That's my undress jacket, and I'm really in my very undress. Women and men, both, so far as Timothy Kent's concerned in the book Fort Pontchartrain at Detroit, said that most French people had a really fancy, nice dress that they would wear when people came to visit, or that when they went out to visit. So there's some examples of nicer coats. This is the damask sort of fabric or silk that could be used for making clothes. This is a short jacket. It just goes to about here. I like the colors of it. And the fabric was given to me by a friend. We had to work really hard to be able to get enough fabric for the front, enough fabric for the back, enough fabric for the sleeves. Something had to give, so we used just a cotton twill in between to take up what you needed fabric to cover. And that's what the women did, is that they used all the fabric that they had. And if they had come to a place like perhaps this part wasn't here when they cut the fabric out, but they had a small piece they could adjust and put in there, they'd just make it fit. So that they used all the fabric that they had. And when they finished wearing their clothing, like this chemise that's on its last legs, they would take the best parts of the fabric out of the chemise, and they would remake the chemise maybe in a smaller size for a child, or maybe in a smaller size that would be suitable for the maid. They used up their clothing. They were the original recyclers, reusers, don't waste a thing. Here's an example of wool, and it's a longer jacket. It's nice for winter wear because it keeps you warm.
The fabric inside is beautiful.
This particular wool came from Ireland, and this was the United States.
Okay.
Here's a robe de la Française. When it's put on, it comes to here, but it has the skirt attached that much, and so you have to wear a petticoat under it. And here's the brocade that that comes from the weaving of the cotton and the styles of coming up with brocade. Cotton was wool, so it would become velvet. And the satin is the under petticoat. And this one has a stomacher. The stomacher is attached to the top of the dress over here, and is anchored with hooks and eyes over on the other side. You could put a white petticoat that's been embroidered with black embroidery. It was a style. It's one of my favorite dresses, but I only wore it to 12th night ball in January. Basically because it's velvet and it's a very, very warm and heavy dress. The most important outer piece of clothing for a man or a woman was a cloak. Of course, cloaks were usually made of wool. So I told Theo, find a lightweight wool for your cloak. He didn't. He found the heaviest weight wool he could find. It's coat weight. Then I said, and make sure that it's not a really heavy brocade for the inside of your cloak. Just sort of make it a lightweight cotton. He found the heaviest brocade he could find. It's green. His outer cloak is navy blue wool, heavy, and his inside is a green jacquard fabric, so it's a double woven fabric. You know what? My sewing machine looked at me and said, what? I said, okay. So it was a lot of hand sewing to do. It's basically called a barrel gathering stitch, which is about that wide and it's about that thick, especially when you get two really thick, heavy fabrics together to make it. He loves his cape. He has no complaints.
If you're out at one of the winter events, that cape is a lifesaver. I tell you.
Foot coverings and other accoutrement by woodsmen, trappers, or Indians. Outdoors men, like trappers, woodsmen, or Indians, wore pants, tunics, leggings, or shoes of leather, as well as belts. Suppose the wooden shoes kept the feet dry and warm, but could be slippery in mud. Thick socks make them more comfortable to wear. Also a nice sheepskin over and above. And you cut them out and do nice things with those. Okay. Remember all those questions I asked you to think about? The answer to each one is yes. Coiffes were head coverings that came from provinces of France with the women who made and wore them. The origins of the coifs appear to be insignificant, except that they're part of their culture. Bodices were worn by the women to give support and coverage when they did not want to wear stays. Stays are cool, but this way it is put back here and much more comfortable to wear. France did manufacture and export fabrics to New France in the Mississippi Valley. There were some years that they didn't ship anything at all, not even fabric, to the New World. Partly because of the economics, partly because of being raided and being smuggled by somebody else. Are there any questions? Yes.
Where did you get the sabot?
Pardon?
Where did you get the sabot?
Where did I get
The wooden shoes.
The sabots.
I probably bought them from Smoke and Fire. They come just plain wood, and you do what you have to do with your sabot, your wooden shoes. For me, I had to grind out the toe. The Dremel tool works nicely. I took them to school to the trades teacher when I was substitute teaching, and asked him to cut out about that much from here to here, up here, so that it doesn't hit, right at the top of your bone. I also asked him to cut off the point so that it was a little more rounded. In my case, I painted them. And then I had a friend who did the lovely fleur-de-lis on the toes.
Very fancy.
Yes.
The fabric in what did you call that?
Brocade.
Yes. Would that have been available in the 18th century? It's beautiful.
Yes. They all came over from France. There's a reason for this little doll they sent here. When France sent the fabrics, they sent a doll dressed in the style of Paris of those fabrics. And so they could pass, the women who sewed could pass the dolls around, and they could take it apart, and they could copy the clothing, and they could be right up in the styles of Paris without any trouble. It's called a poupée. I had a fabric shop at one time, and we decided that we would go with, what's it called, in-kind trading. So a fellow wanted 3 or 4 yards of the white wool, and he had 3 of these, 2 this size and one about that big around and that long. That one's black. These came natural leather. So my partner and I said, sure, we'll do that. So we each decided it was worth it to us to keep our little barrel, and we would sell the big barrel. So Theo bought the big barrel. He uses it for some of his medical equipment when he travels and doesn't want to carry his 70-pound box, which I appreciate because I usually get the other end of the 70-pound box. So I dyed mine red. When it's a hot day and I'm perspiring a lot, everything else gets red too. I don't know, there might be a reason not to do that, or a thing to do to keep it from happening. Yes?
What about the scarf or shawl that you're wearing?
It's called a fichu or a modesty cloth. I like to wear a cotton fichu in the summer. Cotton absorbs and wicks away much more easily than if you're wearing the silk in summer. But I like to wear the silk in the winter because it just keeps the warmth right there with you. But yes, it was part of the clothing. Yes?
Just a comment, if you want to see some of the fabrics in Natalia Belting's book, Kaskaskia under the French regime, she lists some of the inventories from Kaskaskia, and you be amazed at the cloth. If you want to find St. Genevieve in our archives, microfilm out of the library, there's a bunch of the state inventories that go from the 1760s to the 1820s, and again, they will list the kind of fabric. And in Jacques Debord's business journal from 1800, he lists all the fabrics that he's selling.
And some of the names of some of those fabrics are interesting. It's fascinating reading. You can find them in Margaret Brown's book of Prairie de Rocher, as well as what you mentioned, Bob, here in St. Genevieve. Yes?
The patterns from Canada, can you get those on the internet?
Yes, I think you can. You go to Parks Canada. To me, they're just lovely showpieces, as well as being good instructional material for making these garments. I've made this coat for Stephen 2 or 3 different times now. One of them is one of my mistakes. I didn't line it with the right fabric. I still don't like it, but he still wears it. Yes?
In the 18th century, people living in Kaskaskia and St. Genevieve, would they have just imported the fabric, or would they have imported the finished product, the clothing?
In the case of cotton, France might have imported the finished garments, but mostly they imported the fabric, the bolts of fabric. It was easier. But I can't imagine voyagers having to portage with 15 bolts of fabric. As well as whatever barrels of salted pork and pots and pans and blankets and all the other stuff that they might have had to carry. Oh, cannon and ammunition. Yes.
What about the care of the fabric? How would they have prevented mildew and moths and things like that?
I don't think they would have. I think they would have just had to live with what happened to the fabric. They might be extremely careful with it so that they kept it in clean, dry places and didn't put it away moist or wet. But fabrics like this, they wouldn't have washed. They may have worn them 10 years, but never would have washed them. They would have hung them out on the clothesline. Maybe, I don't know if they'd have had a light spray to do with them. And they put lavender with their clothing. Lavender defeats the insect life, but also puts a nice smell into the clothing. No, they didn't wash it, and they didn't dry clean it. And that's probably a blessing that they didn't dry clean it, because chemicals are not good for your clothing. And of course, why wear the natural fabrics? That's what they had. Why wear the natural fabrics now? This breeze. I'm not terribly hot. It wicks away the moisture and keeps me comfortable. Whereas I find polyester just kind of coops it all up in you, and it's not very comfortable at all. But even my socks are cotton. They're long jobbies. They keep my feet cool, comfortable. Any other questions? Good, now I can go eat some dessert.
And looks everyone gets to go eat dessert.
Hi, thank you for watching Channel 798. Thank you for watching Channel 7 and 98.
Hi, thank you very much for watching Channel 798.